African colonies and dependencies. Further information: Southern Rhodesia in World War II. British West Africa and the British colonies in East and Southern Africa participated, mainly in the North African, East African, and Middle Eastern theaters. 2 West African and 1 East African divisions served in the Burma campaign. Southern Rhodesia was a self-governing colony, having received responsible government in 1923. It was not a sovereign dominion. It governed itself internally and controlled its own armed forces, but had no diplomatic autonomy, and therefore was officially at war as soon as Britain was at war. The Southern Rhodesian colonial government issued a symbolic declaration of war nevertheless on 3 September 1939, which made no difference diplomatically, but preceded the declarations of war made by all other British dominions and colonies. 47. American colonies and dependencies. These included the British West Indies, British Honduras, British Guiana, and the Falkland Islands. The Dominion of Newfoundland was directly ruled as a royal colony from 1933 to 1949, run by a governor appointed by London, who made the decisions regarding Newfoundland. Europe. The Cyprus Regiment was formed by the British government during the Second World War and made part of the British Army structure. It was mostly Greek Cypriot volunteers and Turkish Cypriot inhabitants of Cyprus, but also included other Commonwealth nationalities. On a brief visit to Cyprus in 1943, Winston Churchill praised the soldiers of the Cyprus Regiment who have served honorably on many fields from Libya to Dunkirk. About 30,000 Cypriots served in the Cyprus Regiment. The regiment was involved in action from the very start and served at Dunkirk in the Greek campaign. About 600 soldiers were captured in Kalamata in 1941. North Africa, Operation Compass, France, the Middle East, and Italy. Many soldiers were taken prisoner, especially at the beginning of the war, and were interned in various POW camps, Stalag, including Lambsdorff, Stalag WWII, Stalag IVC at Wistritz Bay Teplitz, and Stalag 4B near Most in the Czech Republic. The soldiers captured in Kalamata were transported by train to prisoner of war camps. France. Main article: France during World War II. Further information: Liberation of France and military history of France during World War II. Free French forces at the Battle of Bir-Hakeim, 1942. War declared. FAFL Free French GCII 5, Lafayette, receiving ex-USAAF Curtiss P-40 fighters at Casablanca, French Morocco. The French fleet scuttled itself rather than fall into the hands of the Axis after their invasion of Vichy France on 11 November 1942. After Germany invaded Poland, France declared war on Germany on 3 September 1939. 48. In January 1940, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier made a major speech denouncing the actions of Germany. At the end of 5 months of war, one thing has become more and more clear. It is that Germany seeks to establish a domination of the world completely different from any known in world history. The domination at which the Nazis aim is not limited to the displacement of the balance of power and the imposition of the supremacy of one nation. It seeks the systematic and total destruction of those conquered by Hitler, and it does not treaty with the nations which it has subdued. He destroys them. He takes from them their whole political and economic existence and seeks even to deprive them of their history and culture. He wishes only to consider them as vital space and a vacant territory over which he has every right. The human beings who constitute these nations are for him only cattle. He orders their massacre or migration. He compels them to make room for their conquerors. He does not even take the trouble to impose any war tribute on them. He just takes all their wealth, and to prevent any revolt, he scientifically seeks the physical and moral degradation of those whose independence he has taken away. 48. France experienced several major phases of action during World War II. The phony War of 1939–1940, also called Drôle de Guerre in France, Dzielna Wojna in Poland, both meaning strange war, or the Sitzkrieg, sitting war, a pun on Blitzkrieg in Germany. The Battle of France in June 1940, which resulted in the defeat of the Allies, the fall of the French Third Republic, the German occupation of northern and western France, and the creation of the rump state Vichy France, which received diplomatic recognition from the Axis and most neutral countries including the United States. 49. The period of resistance against the occupation and Franco-French struggle for control of the colonies between the Vichy regime and the Free French, who continued the fight on the Allies' side after the appeal of 18 June by General Charles de Gaulle, recognized by the United Kingdom as France's government in exile. It culminated in the Allied landings in North Africa on 11 November 1942, when Vichy ceased to exist as an independent entity after having been invaded by both the Axis and the Allies simultaneously, being thereafter only the nominal government in charge during the occupation of France. Vichy forces in French North Africa switched allegiance and merged with the Free French to participate in the campaigns of Tunisia and of Italy, and the invasion of Corsica in 1943–44. The liberation of mainland France beginning with D-Day on 6 June 1944 and Operation Overlord, and then with Operation Dragoon on 15 August 1944, leading to the liberation of Paris on 25 August 1944 by the Free French 2e Division Blindé, and the installation of the Provisional Government of the French Republic in the newly liberated capital. Participation of the re-established Provisional French Republic's First Army in the Allied advance from Paris to the Rhine, and the Western Allied invasion of Germany, until VE Day on 8 May 1945. Colonies and dependencies. Main article: French colonial empire. Africa. In Africa, these included French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, the League of Nations mandates of French Cameroon and French Togoland, French Madagascar, French Somaliland, and the protectorates of French Tunisia and French Morocco. French Algeria was then not a colony or dependency, but a fully fledged part of metropolitan France. Asia and Oceania. The fall of Damascus to the Allies, late June 1941. A car carrying Free French commanders General Georges Catroux and General Paul-Louis Le Gentilhomme enters the city, escorted by French Circassian cavalry, Guards T-Turques. In Asia and Oceania, France has several territories: French Polynesia, Wallis and Futuna, New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, French Indochina, French India, Guangzhouwan, the mandates of Greater Lebanon and French Syria. The French government in 1936 attempted to grant independence to its mandate of Syria in the Franco-Syrian Treaty of Independence of 1936, signed by France and Syria. However, opposition to the treaty grew in France, and the treaty was not ratified. Syria had become an official republic in 1930 and was largely self-governing. In 1941, a British-led invasion supported by Free French forces expelled Vichy French forces in Operation Exporter. Americas. France had several colonies in America, namely Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, and Saint Pierre and Miquelon. Soviet Union. Further information: Military history of the Soviet Union during World War II. Soviet soldiers and T-34 tanks advancing near Bryansk in 1942. Soviet soldiers fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad during the Battle of Stalingrad. Soviet Il-2 ground attack aircraft attacking German ground forces during the Battle of Kursk, 1943. History. In the lead-up to the war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, relations between the two states underwent several stages. General Secretary Joseph Stalin and the government of the Soviet Union had supported so-called Popular Front movements of anti-fascists, including communists and non-communists from 1935 to 1939-50. The Popular Front strategy was terminated from 1939 to 1941, when the Soviet Union cooperated with Germany in 1939 in the occupation and partitioning of Poland. The Soviet leadership refused to endorse either the Allies or the Axis from 1939 to 1941, as it called the Allied Axis conflict an imperialist war. 50. Stalin had studied Hitler, including reading Mein Kampf, and from it knew of Hitler's motives for destroying the Soviet Union. 51. As early as in 1933, the Soviet leadership voiced its concerns with the alleged threat of a potential German invasion of the country should Germany attempt a conquest of Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. And in December 1933, negotiations began for the issuing of a joint Polish-Soviet declaration guaranteeing the sovereignty of the three Baltic countries. 52. However, Poland withdrew from the negotiations following German and Finnish objections. 52. The Soviet Union and Germany at this time competed with each other for influence in Poland. 53. On 20 August 1939, forces of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under General Georgy Zhukov, together with the People's Republic of Mongolia, eliminated the threat of conflict in the east with a victory over Imperial Japan at the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol in eastern Mongolia. On the same day, Soviet Party leader Joseph Stalin received a telegram from German Chancellor Adolf Hitler, suggesting that German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop fly to Moscow for diplomatic talks. After receiving a lukewarm response throughout the spring and summer, Stalin abandoned attempts for a better diplomatic relationship with France and the United Kingdom. 54. On 23 August, Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov signed the Non-Aggression Pact, including secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into defined spheres of influence for the two regimes, and specifically concerning the partition of the Polish state in the event of its territorial and political rearrangement. 40. 148-151. On 15 September 1939, Stalin concluded a durable ceasefire with Japan. To take effect the following day, it would be upgraded to a non-aggression pact in April 1941. 40. 16. 154. The day after that, 17 September, Soviet forces invaded Poland from the east. Although some fighting continued until 5 October, the two invading armies held at least one joint military parade on 25 September and reinforced their non-military partnership with the German-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Demarcation on 28 September. German and Soviet cooperation against Poland in 1939 has been described as co-belligerence. 55-56. On 30 November, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, for which it was expelled from the League of Nations. In the following year of 1940, while the world's attention was focused upon the German invasion of France and Norway, 57, the Soviet Union militarily, 58, occupied and annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 59, as well as parts of Romania. German-Soviet treaties were brought to an end by the German surprise attack on the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941. After the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin endorsed the Western Allies as part of a renewed Popular Front strategy against Germany and called for the international communist movement to make a coalition with all those who opposed the Nazis. 50. The Soviet Union soon entered in alliance with the United Kingdom. Following the Soviet Union, a number of other communist, pro-Soviet or Soviet-controlled forces fought against the Axis powers during the Second World War. They were as follows: the Albanian National Liberation Front, the Chinese Red Army, the Greek National Liberation Front, the Hukbalahap, the Malayan Communist Party, the People's Republic of Mongolia, the Polish People's Army, the Tuvan People's Republic, annexed by the Soviet Union in 1944. 60. The Viet Minh and the Yugoslav partisans. The Soviet Union intervened against Japan and its client state in Manchuria in 1945, cooperating with the nationalist government of China and the Nationalist Party led by Chiang Kai-shek, though also cooperating, preferring, and encouraging the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao Zedong to take effective control of Manchuria after expelling Japanese forces. 61. Central Asian and Caucasian republics. Among the Soviet forces during World War II, millions of troops were from the Soviet Central Asian republics. They included 1,433,230 soldiers from Uzbekistan, 62, more than 1 million from Kazakhstan, 63, and more than 700,000 from Azerbaijan, 64, among other Central Asian republics. United States. Further information. Military history of the United States during World War II. American Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber aircraft, attacking the Japanese cruiser Mikuma during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. U.S. Marines during the Guadalcanal Campaign in November 1942. War justifications. The United States had indirectly supported Britain's war effort against Germany up to 1941 and declared its opposition to territorial aggrandizement. Materiel support to Britain was provided, while the U.S. was officially neutral via the Lend-Lease Act starting in 1941. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in August 1941, promulgated the Atlantic Charter that pledged commitment to achieving the final destruction of Nazi tyranny. 65. Signing the Atlantic Charter, and thereby joining the United Nations, was the way a state joined the Allies and also became eligible for membership in the United Nations world body that formed in 1945. The United States strongly supported the nationalist government in China in its war with Japan and provided military equipment, supplies, and volunteers to the nationalist government of China to assist in its war effort. 66. In December 1940, Japan opened the war with its attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States declared war on Japan. And Japan's allies Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing the United States into World War II. The United States played a central role in liaising among the Allies and especially among the Big Four. At the Arcadia Conference in December 1941, shortly after the United States entered the war, the United States and Britain established a combined Chiefs of Staff, based in Washington, which deliberated the military decisions of both the United States and Britain. History. On 8 December 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Congress declared war on Japan at the request of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This was followed by Germany and Italy declaring war on the United States on 11 December, bringing the country into the European theater. The United States led Allied forces in the Pacific Theater against Japanese forces from 1941 to 1945. From 1943 to 1945, the United States also led and coordinated the Western Allies' war effort in Europe under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, followed by Japan's swift attacks on Allied locations throughout the Pacific, resulted in major United States losses in the first several months in the war, including losing control of the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and several Aleutian Islands including Attu and Kiska to Japanese forces. American naval forces attained some early successes against Japan. One was the bombing of Japanese industrial centers in the Doolittle Raid. Another was repelling a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea during the Battle of the Coral Sea. 67. A major turning point in the Pacific War was the Battle of Midway, where American naval forces were outnumbered by Japanese forces that had been sent to Midway to draw out and destroy American aircraft carriers in the Pacific and seize control of Midway that would place Japanese forces in proximity to Hawaii. 68. However, American forces managed to sink 4 of Japan's 6 large aircraft carriers that had initiated the attack on Pearl Harbor, along with other attacks on Allied forces. Afterwards, the United States began an offensive against Japanese captured positions. The Guadalcanal Campaign from 1942 to 1943 was a major contention point, where Allied and Japanese forces struggled to gain control of Guadalcanal. American consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber aircraft during the bombing of oil refineries in Ploiești, Romania on 1 August 1943 during Operation Tidal Wave. American consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber aircraft during the bombing of oil refineries in Ploiești, Romania on 1 August 1943 during Operation Tidal Wave. U.S. soldiers departing landing craft during the Normandy landings on 6 June 1944 known as D-Day. U.S. soldiers departing landing craft during the Normandy landings on 6 June 1944 known as D-Day. Colonies and dependencies. Philippine scouts at Fort William McKinley firing a 37 anti-tank gun in training. In the Americas and the Pacific. The United States held multiple dependencies in the Americas, such as Alaska, the Panama Canal Zone, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. In the Pacific, it held multiple island dependencies such as American Samoa, Guam, Hawaii, Midway Islands, Wake Island, and others. These dependencies were directly involved in the Pacific campaign of the war. In Asia, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was a sovereign protectorate referred to as an associated state of the United States. From late 1941 to 1944, the Philippines was occupied by Japanese forces, who established the Second Philippine Republic as a client state that had nominal control over the country. China. Main article, Second Sino-Japanese War. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union provided military assistance to the Kuomintang, or the Nationalists, and helped reorganize their party along Leninist lines, a unification of party, state, and army. In exchange, the Nationalists agreed to let members of the Chinese Communist Party join the Nationalists on an individual basis. However, following the nominal unification of China at the end of the Northern Expedition in 1928, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek purged leftists from his party and fought against the revolting Chinese Communist Party, former warlords, and other militarist factions. A fragmented China provided easy opportunities for Japan to gain territories piece by piece without engaging in total war. Following the 1931 Mukden incident, the puppet state of Manchukuo was established. Throughout the early to mid-1930s, Chiang's anti-communist and anti-militarist campaigns continued while he fought small, incessant conflicts against Japan, usually followed by unfavorable settlements and concessions after military defeats. In 1936, Chiang was forced to cease his anti-communist military campaigns after his kidnap and release by Zhang Zuoliang, and reluctantly formed a nominal alliance with the Communists, while the Communists agreed to fight under the nominal command of the Nationalists against the Japanese. Following the Marco Polo Bridge incident of 7 July 1937, China and Japan became embroiled in a full-scale war. The Soviet Union, wishing to keep China in the fight against Japan, supplied China with military assistance until 1941, when it signed a non-aggression pact with Japan. In December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, China formally declared war on Japan, as well as Germany and Italy. As part of the war's Pacific theater, China became the only member of the Allies to commit more troops than one of the Big Three, 69, exceeding even the number of Soviet troops on the Eastern Front, 70. Continuous clashes between the communists and nationalists behind enemy lines culminated in a major military conflict between these two former allies that effectively ended their cooperation against the Japanese. And China had been divided between the internationally recognized nationalist China, under the leadership of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and Communist China, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, until the Japanese surrendered in 1945. Factions. Nationalists. Main article: Nationalist government. Soldiers of the National Revolutionary Army associated with Nationalist China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Prior to the alliance of Germany and Italy to Japan, the nationalist government held close relations with both Germany and Italy. In the early 1930s, Sino-German cooperation existed between the nationalist government and Germany in military and industrial matters. Nazi Germany provided the largest proportion of Chinese arms imports and technical expertise. Relations between the nationalist government and Italy during the 1930s varied. However, even after the nationalist government followed League of Nations sanctions against Italy for its invasion of Ethiopia, the international sanctions proved unsuccessful. And relations between the fascist government in Italy and the nationalist government in China returned to normal shortly afterwards. 71. Up until 1936, Mussolini had provided the nationalists with Italian military air and naval missions to help the nationalists fight against Japanese incursions and communist insurgents. 71. Italy also held strong commercial interests and a strong commercial position in China supported by the Italian concession in Tianjin. 71. However, after 1936, the relationship between the nationalist government and Italy changed due to a Japanese diplomatic proposal to recognize the Italian Empire that included occupied Ethiopia within it in exchange for Italian recognition of Manchukuo. Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano accepted this offer by Japan, and on 23 October 1936, Japan recognized the Italian Empire and Italy recognized Manchukuo. As well as discussing increasing commercial links between Italy and Japan. 72. The nationalist government held close relations with the United States. The United States opposed Japan's invasion of China in 1937, that it considered an illegal violation of China's sovereignty, and offered the nationalist government diplomatic, economic, and military assistance during its war against Japan. In particular, the United States sought to bring the Japanese war effort to a complete halt by imposing a full embargo on all trade between the United States to Japan. Japan was dependent on the United States for 80% of its petroleum, resulting in an economic and military crisis for Japan that could not continue its war effort with China without access to petroleum. 73. In November 1940, American military aviator Claire Lee Chennault, upon observing the dire situation in the air war between China and Japan, set out to organize a volunteer squadron of American fighter pilots to fight alongside the Chinese against Japan, known as the Flying Tigers. 74. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt accepted dispatching them to China in early 1941. 74. However, they only became operational shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Soviet Union recognized the Republic of China, but urged reconciliation with the Chinese Communist Party and inclusion of communists in the government. 75. The Soviet Union also urged military and cooperation between nationalist China and communist China during the war. 75. Even though China had been fighting the longest among all the Allied powers, it only officially joined the Allies after the attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. China fought the Japanese Empire before joining the Allies in the Pacific War. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek thought Allied victory was assured with the entrance of the United States into the war, and he declared war on Germany and the other Axis states. However, Allied aid remained low because the Burma Road was closed, and the Allies suffered a series of military defeats against Japan early on in the campaign. General Sun Li-jen led the ROC forces to the relief of 7,000 British forces trapped by the Japanese in the Battle of Yeningyong. He then reconquered North Burma and re-established the land route to China by the Ledo Road. But the bulk of military aid did not arrive until the spring of 1945. More than 1.5 million Japanese troops were trapped in the China theater, troops that otherwise could have been deployed elsewhere if China had collapsed and made a separate peace. Communists. Main article: Communist-controlled China, 1927–1949. Soldiers of the First Workers' and Peasants' Army associated with Communist China during the Sino-Japanese War. Victorious Chinese Communist soldiers holding the flag of the Republic of China during the 100 Regiments Offensive. Communist China had been tacitly supported by the Soviet Union since the 1920s. Though the Soviet Union diplomatically recognized the Republic of China, Joseph Stalin supported cooperation between the nationalists and the communists, including pressuring the nationalist government to grant the communist state and military positions in the government. 75. This was continued into the 1930s, that fell in line with the Soviet Union's subversion policy of popular fronts to increase communist influence in governments. 75. The Soviet Union urged military and cooperation between Communist China and Nationalist China during China's war against Japan. 75. Initially, Mao Zedong accepted the demands of the Soviet Union, and in 1938 had recognized Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of the Chinese people. 76. In turn, the Soviet Union accepted Mao's tactic of continuous guerrilla warfare in the countryside that involved a goal of extending the communist bases, even if it would result in increased tensions with the nationalists. 76. After the breakdown of their cooperation with the nationalists in 1941, the communists prospered and grew as the war against Japan dragged on, building up their sphere of influence wherever opportunities were presented, mainly through rural mass organizations, administrative, land and tax reform measures favoring poor peasants, while the nationalists attempted to neutralize the spread of communist influence by military blockade and fighting the Japanese at the same time. 77. The Communist Party's position in China was boosted further upon the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945 against the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo and the Japanese Kwantung Army in China and Manchuria. Upon the intervention of the Soviet Union against Japan in World War II in 1945, Mao Zedong in April and May 1945 had planned to mobilize 150,000 to 250,000 soldiers from across China to work with forces of the Soviet Union in capturing Manchuria. 78. Other Allied states. Australia. Further information: Military history of Australia during World War II. Australia was a sovereign dominion under the Australian monarchy, as per the Statute of Westminster 1931. At the start of the war, Australia followed Britain's foreign policies and accordingly declared war against Germany on 3 September 1939. Australian foreign policy became more independent after the Australian Labor Party formed government in October 1941, and Australia separately declared war against Finland, Hungary, and Romania on 8 December 1941, and against Japan the next day. 79. Belgium. Main article: Belgium in World War II. Members of the Belgian resistance with a Canadian soldier in Bruges, September 1944, during the Battle of the Scheldt. Before the war, Belgium had pursued a policy of neutrality and only became an Allied member after being invaded by Germany on 10 May 1940. During the ensuing fighting, Belgian forces fought alongside French and British forces against the invaders. While the British and French were struggling against the fast German advance elsewhere on the front, the Belgian forces were pushed into a pocket to the north. On 28 May, the King Leopold III surrendered himself and his military to the Germans, having decided the Allied cause was lost. The legal Belgian government was reformed as a government in exile in London. Belgian troops and pilots continued to fight on the Allied side as the Free Belgian Forces. Belgium itself was occupied, but a sizable resistance was formed and was loosely coordinated by the government in exile and other Allied powers. British and Canadian troops arrived in Belgium in September 1944, and the capital, Brussels, was liberated on 6 September. Because of the Ardennes offensive, the country was only fully liberated in early 1945. Colonies and dependencies. Main article: Belgian colonial empire. Belgium held the colony of the Belgian Congo and the League of Nations Mandate of Rwanda-Urundi. The Belgian Congo was not occupied and remained loyal to the Allies as an important economic asset, while its deposits of uranium were useful to the Allied efforts to develop the atomic bomb. Troops from the Belgian Congo participated in the East African campaign against the Italians. The colonial force publique also served in other theaters including Madagascar, the Middle East, India, and Burma within British units. Brazil. Main article: Brazil in World War II. Initially, Brazil maintained a position of neutrality, trading with both the Allies and the Axis, while Brazilian President Getulio Vargas's quasi-fascist policies indicated a leaning toward the Axis powers. Citation needed. However, as the war progressed, trade with the Axis countries became almost impossible, and the United States initiated forceful diplomatic and economic efforts to bring Brazil onto the Allied side. Citation needed. At the beginning of 1942, Brazil permitted the United States to set up air bases on its territory, especially in Natal, strategically located at the easternmost corner of the South American continent. And on 28 January, the country severed diplomatic relations with Germany, Japan, and Italy. After that, 36 Brazilian merchant ships were sunk by the German and Italian navies, which led the Brazilian government to declare war against Germany and Italy on 22 August 1942.